I never thought a place meant for peace could turn into a battlefield. When I bought my fishing cabin 10 years ago, I imagined slow mornings, the smell of pine, and the sound of water lapping against the dock. No phones, no traffic, just me, my boat, and a cup of coffee that stayed warm long enough to watch the sunrise. It was the kind of quiet that healed you. The cabin sat just beyond the official boundary of a neighborhood called Clearwater Estates. Nice homes, clean streets, and an HOA that made sure every mailbox looked identical. I figured as long as I stayed out of their area, I'd stay out of their nonsense. But I was wrong. It started small. One Saturday, I saw a couple of people walking near my property line, clipboards in hand, vests with Clearwater HOA printed on the back. I thought they were lost, maybe new to the area. I stepped outside and asked if they needed directions. They smiled awkwardly and said they were just assessing community boundaries. Well, my property ends right there, I told them, pointing to the old oak tree by the fence. Everything past it isn't community land. They nodded, scribbled something on their clipboard, and walked away. I didn't think much of it. A week later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from the HOA president, a woman named Karen Matthews. She congratulated me on becoming part of the Clearwater community and listed a few minor adjustments I needed to make. Apparently, my cabin didn't meet aesthetic guidelines, my dock was unapproved, and my mailbox violated visual harmony standards. I laughed. I wasn't part of their HOA, and I had the deed to prove it. I tossed the letter in the trash and went fishing. But Karen wasn't the type to be ignored. The next morning, a white SUV parked just outside my gate. A woman stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, holding a clipboard and walking like she owned the place. I recognized her from the HOA website, Karen herself. "Excuse me," she said, waving at me through the fence. "You can't have that chain lock on your gate. It's against our community's safety policy." "Your community," I corrected, "not mine's." She frowned like I'd insulted her personally. "Your cabin falls under our extended jurisdiction. We're simply trying to maintain order." "Order's fine," I said, "as long as it's on your property." She stared at me for a few seconds, then muttered, "We'll see about that," before walking back to her car. That's when I realized she wasn't just nosy, she was on a mission. Within a week, I got another letter. This one was titled Violation Notice. It came with photos of my dock, my cabin, even my fishing gear hanging on the wall. I don't know how she got those pictures, but they weren't taken from the road. Someone had stepped onto my land. That night, I installed security cameras and changed the locks. I wasn't going to let a bunch of clipboard warriors walk through my property again. The next morning, I heard car doors slam. 2 sheriff's deputies were at my gate. One of them asked, "Sir, are you the owner of this property?" I nodded, confused. "Yeah, what's going on?" The deputy looked uncomfortable. "We got a report from a neighbor claiming someone might be held against their will here." I blinked. "Come agains." He sighed. "She said she heard screams coming from this cabin." I couldn't help but laugh. Screams, the only sound around here is the radio and the fish flopping. They still had to check, so I let them look around. They went through the cabin, checked the rooms, even peeked in the storage shed. When they were done, the older deputy shook his head. "You wouldn't believe how many calls we get from that lady," he said. "She thinks she's the sheriff of Clearwater." I told him I'd appreciate if he let her know to stay off my property. He chuckled. "We'll tell her, but she doesn't listen much." I thought that would be the end of it. 2 days later, I caught a glimpse of Karen again, standing across the lake with binoculars. When she saw me looking, she lowered them slowly and waved like she was checking in on an old friend. I didn't wave back. Instead, I went inside and printed a copy of my deed, just in case I needed proof again. The following morning, there was a fresh envelope taped to my cabin door. I peeled it off and read the bold heading, Mandatory HOA Enrollment Notice. My stomach sank and I couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. She'd really done it. The letter said the HOA had voted to extend its jurisdiction to include adjacent lakeside properties for community integrity. In other words, she was trying to absorb my cabin into her empire. I looked out across the lake where I knew she was watching and said quietly, "Not today, Karen. Not ever." But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. This was just the first cast in what would turn into a long, ugly fight. And the next move would be hers. I didn't even have a chance to breathe before Karen made her next move. 2 days after that ridiculous mandatory HOA enrollment notice, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel. another police car. This time it wasn't just a welfare check. One of the deputies looked irritated before he even got out. He motioned for me to come over. "Morning," he said, "you the property owners?" "Yeah, again," I said, already tired of the routine. "Let me guess, Karen called." He exchanged a glance with his partner. "She said you're squatting here illegally, claims the property been condemned and that you might be dangerous." I stared at him, trying not to laugh. Dangerous because I lock my own gate. He rubbed his neck. "We have to follow up. Mind if we take a look around again?" I opened the gate and let them in. They walked through the same routine, checking corners, asking questions, jotting notes. By the time they were done, both looked embarrassed. "Sorry, sir," the older deputy said. "False report again. We'll make a note of it. She's on our radar now." I thanked them, but as their car pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing on the hill near the community sign. Hands on hips. Watching. She didn't even try to hide it. That's when I realized she wasn't just trying to annoy me. She was trying to build a case, to make me look like a problem until the county forced me to comply. Later that afternoon, I heard voices near the water. When I stepped outside, 3 people were walking along my shoreline, snapping pictures with their phones. They wore polos with the HOA logo and carried measuring tapes. I walked down the dock and called out, "You folks lost again." The guy in front looked startled. "Just conducting a property assessment for our records." "Your records don't belong on my land," I said. "This isn't part of your HOA." Before he could answer, I heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice from across the fence line. "We're within our rights," she shouted. "You're part of the neighborhood expansion whether you like it or not." "Expansion doesn't mean invasion," I yelled back. She crossed her arms. "We'll see what the county says." I almost invited her to call them right then, but I decided to let her hang herself with her own rope. I knew the expansion wasn't legally recorded. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was an HOA compliance package. It included rules about landscaping, exterior paint colors, and even trash pickup schedules. Tucked between the pages was a fine notice for non-compliant architecture. The fine amount, $3,000. That was the moment it stopped being funny. I drove straight to the county clerk's office, deed in hand. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses sliding down her nose, looked through the records. "No," she said, tapping her screen. "The Clearwater HOA hasn't filed any expansion paperwork. Legally, they can't touch you." I exhaled, half relieved, half furious. So they're faking documents now. She shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time someone tried. You might want to file a complaint just to protect yourself." I thanked her and left, but I didn't go home right away. I made a detour to the HOA office, a small, sterile building tucked behind the neighborhood clubhouse. When I walked in, Karen was sitting at the front desk like she'd been waiting for me. She smiled, that fake, sugary smile people give right before they stab you in the back. "Mr. Carter, what brings you here?" I held up the compliance packet. "You're sending illegal fines and false notices. I talked to the county clerk. None of this expansion is valid." Her expression didn't change. "We're in the process of finalizing the paperwork." "No," I said, "you're in the process of committing fraud." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You really want to play this game with me?" I met her eyes. "No game, just the law." I left before she could answer, but I could feel her glare burning into the back of my neck as I walked out. That night, I checked my security footage again. Nothing unusual. I went to bed around midnight. The next morning, when I opened my cabin door, a brand new notice was taped to it. This one wasn't printed on HOA letterhead. It looked like an official county form at first glance, but the details were sloppy. The signature line had my name, only the handwriting wasn't mine. At the top in bold were the words "Mandatory HOA Enrollment, Property Owner Acknowledgement." She'd actually forged my signature. My first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by anger. I snapped a photo and saved it. I knew then that this wasn't just harassment, it was personal. I looked out toward the road and saw Karen's white SUV parked behind the trees. She wasn't even trying to hide anymore. That's when it hit me. She wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. But neither was I. I grabbed my phone and started calling the county office again. This time, I wasn't asking for advice. I was filing an official complaint. Still, I had this feeling in my gut that Karen wasn't finished. She was bold enough to forge documents. Who knew what she'd try next? As the sun went down, I walked around the property one last time, making sure every camera was on, every door locked. When I came back to the front porch, a shadow moved near the driveway. For a second, I thought it was an animal, but then the shape straightened, human, watching. By the time I shouted, the figure disappeared into the trees. And that's when I realized this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was turning into something darker. And Karen was only getting started. The next morning, I drove into town with a pit in my stomach. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow from the night before. Whoever it was, they'd been standing too close to my cabin. Too quiet, too deliberate. Karen's games were getting bold, and I had no doubt she was behind it. I went straight to the county clerk's office again, carrying the fake enrollment notice. When the clerk saw it, she frowned and called over her supervisor. They studied it carefully. "That's not one of ours," the supervisor said, tapping the seal printed on top. "This is a photocopy of an old code enforcement template. See the font? It's wrong." "So someone forged a government document," I said. The clerk nodded slowly. "Whoever did this could get in serious trouble if you report it." I smiled grimly. Good, that's the plan. When I left the office, I called a friend of mine, Rick. He was a property lawyer who loved nothing more than dealing with HOA nonsense. I told him everything. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. "Man, I've seen some petty HOA moves, but forging your signature, that's federal," he said. "Keep every letter, every notice, every photo. We might need them." "You think she'll back off if she gets wind I've called a lawyer?" He chuckled. "People like her don't back off, they double down." He wasn't wrong. By the time I got back to the cabin, a fresh envelope was already in my mailbox. Karen must have hand-delivered it. It was labeled Urgent Compliance Reminder. Inside, it listed new rules for recently integrated Lakeside members, complete with another fine, this time for unauthorized water access. Apparently, fishing from my own dock was now an unapproved recreational activity. I laughed out loud. It was either that or scream. I decided to make my move. I printed a copy of my deed again, highlighted the property boundary in bright yellow, and wrote a short note, "Not today, Karen." I mailed it straight to the HOA office. The next day, I drove by their building just to see if she got it. Through the glass door, I saw her inside, holding my letter with a scowl that could melt paint. Her assistant whispered something to her, and Karen's face shifted from irritation to pure fury. She picked up the phone, and I could see her mouth moving fast. She pointed toward the window right at me. So I waved. That night, I thought maybe she'd finally gotten the message. The lake was quiet again, and the crickets were back to their usual chorus. I grilled some fish, had a beer, and sat on the porch. For a few hours, it felt like the old days. Until a truck's headlights swept across my property. I stood up as two men in reflective vests got out. They walked toward the cabin with clipboards. "Evening," I called out. "You guys lost." One of them hesitated. "We're here for a demolition assessment." "Oh, what?" "We got an order to evaluate this structure for removal. Says it's in violation of community safety codes." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Who signed that order?" He flipped his clipboard around, and there it was again, my name, only it wasn't my handwriting. "You gotta be kidding me," I said, snatching a photo with my phone. "You realize this is fraud, right?" The men looked uneasy. "We just go where we're told, sir." "Told by who?" He pointed back toward the road, the Clearwater HOA office. I clenched my jaw. Karen had actually filed for my cabin to be demolished. I made a few calls that night. First to Rick, who told me to report everything to the sheriff. Then to the county building department, who confirmed no legal demolition order existed. When I hung up, I sat there in the dark for a long time, watching the cabin's reflection in the lake. This place had been my sanctuary, and now some neighborhood tyrant wanted to wipe it off the map because she couldn't control it. The next morning, I drove straight to the HOA office. The receptionist tried to stop me, but I walked right past. Karen was in her office mid-phone call, wearing that smug little grin that made my blood boil. She froze when she saw me. "We need to talk," I said. "You can't just barge in here," she snapped. I placed the fake demolition notice on her desk. "Care to explain this?" She glanced at it, then back at me. "I don't know what that is." "Really? Because your signature's on the contractor order." Her face tightened, but she stayed silent. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo I'd taken the night before, her printed letterhead, my forged name. That's a crime, Karen. She stood up slowly, voice trembling with forced calm. You should leave before I call security. Call whoever you want, I said. But next time it's not security you'll be talking to, it's the sheriff. I turned to leave, and as I reached the door she called out, You'll regret crossing me. I stopped just long enough to say, No, Karen, you're the one who's going to regret this. When I got back to the cabin, the morning sun was cutting across the lake, the water still and glassy. I felt calm for the first time in weeks, even though I knew it wouldn't last. Karen had just been caught red-handed, and people like her didn't take humiliation well. As I stood there on the porch, looking out at the water, a cold wind swept through the trees. The kind that carried warnings if you listened closely enough. Something told me this was far from over. And the next time Karen came for me, she wasn't going to settle for paperwork. The next day started like any other, but something about the air felt off. Maybe it was the silence. Even the birds seemed cautious, as if they knew trouble was circling. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the morning fog drift across the lake. It was peaceful for about 10 minutes, then my phone buzzed. An email from the Clearwater HOAs. The subject line read, Final Notice, Property Demolition Authorization. My stomach tightened. I opened it, and there it was again, my forged signature at the bottom of a new form, this time accompanied by a stamped date and approval from property owner. She doubled down on the lie. That was it. No more phone calls, no more polite conversations. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the HOA office. The place looked as smug as ever, perfectly trimmed hedges, a flag flapping lazily, and a big sign that said Community Pride Starts Here. I parked in front and walked through the glass doors. The receptionist, a young woman who looked too nervous for her job, stood up immediately. Sir, do you have an appointment? No, I said, holding up my phone. But your boss has a habit of signing my name to things I never approved. Her eyes widened and she started to stammer something, but I was already walking toward Karen's office. When I pushed open the door, Karen was sitting at her desk, pretending to be on a phone call. But her eyes flicked up and froze the second she saw me. The papers on her desk caught my attention, a stack of documents with familiar letterheads, my name on several pages. I took out my phone and started recording. You mind explaining this? She lowered the phone slowly, her tone sharp. You can't just storm into my office and start recording. This is private property. Private, I said. You've been treating my property like your personal sandbox for weeks. She stood up, trying to act calm. You're mistaken. Everything we've done is within community regulation. You mean the community I'm not even part of? I stepped closer, grabbed one of the documents off her desk, and pointed at the signature line. You really thought I wouldn't notice you faking my name again? For a split second, something flickered across her face, fear, guilt, maybe both, but it was gone as fast as it came. She snatched the paper from my hand. You have no right to take our records. That's not a record, I said, that's evidence. I took another photo before she could react. The camera flash made her flinch. She reached across the desk, trying to grab my phone. You can't take that. Watch me. She froze, then straightened her blazer. You're making a mistake, Mr. Carter. Do you really want to make an enemy of your entire community? I smiled, calm but cold. No, just you. As I turned to leave, she called after me, voice dripping with venom. You'll regret this. You'll regret ever stepping foot in Clearwater. I didn't bother answering. By the time I got back to my truck, my hands were shaking, but not from fear, adrenaline. I knew I finally had enough to shut her down. I drove straight to the sheriff's office and showed them the photos, the fake notices, everything. The deputy from before, same guy who'd handled her earlier reports, looked both amused and exhausted. That woman's a headache, he muttered, but this is serious. He took notes and promised to send an officer to speak with her. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little relief. I drove home, pulled into the gravel drive, and stepped out of my truck. The air smelled like rain, heavy and clean. I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was winding down. Then I saw it. The gate to my property hung open, the lock chain cut clean through. My heart dropped. I ran down the path toward the cabin, my boots crunching on the wet gravel. And there, parked right in front of my porch, was Karen's white SUV. Behind it, two men in hard hats standing next to a trailer loaded with tools and lumber. For a moment, none of us said a word. The rain started to fall, soft but steady, tapping on the cabin roof like warning drums. Finally, I spoke. "You're trespassing." One of the men shifted uncomfortably. "We were told to begin demolition prep, got a work order signed and everything." "Let me guess," I said, walking forward, "signed by me." He nodded, holding up the paper, and sure enough, there was my name again, forged perfectly. Karen stood behind them, arms crossed, a smirk curling at the edge of her mouth. "You can't stop community progress," she said. "The HOA board has already approved the removal of unsafe structures." "Unsafe?" I looked at the cabin. "It's more solid than your sense of reality." She took a step closer. "You can't win, Mr. Carter. You're just one man, we're a community." I smiled, calm and steady. "Then this community's about to learn what happens when it breaks the law." I turned, pulled out my phone, and started recording again. Karen's smirk vanished the second she saw the red light blinking. The workers froze, unsure what to do. And that's when I said it loud enough for the camera to catch every word. "This is illegal trespassing and attempted property destruction. The sheriff's office already has your name on record." She tried to order the workers to keep going, but they backed off. One of them muttered, "Lady, we're not touching this, not without a real permit." They got in their truck and drove off. Karen just stood there fuming. She finally spat out, "This isn't over." She drove away, tires spinning on the wet dirt road. But something told me she wasn't bluffing this time. And sure enough, that night when I checked the security feed, the camera by the gate had gone dark. Someone had taken it out. She was coming back, I could feel it. By the next morning, the air around the lake felt heavy, like something was about to snap. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop, texts from neighbors, pictures, even a video. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting right on the dock in front of my cabin. About 20 people stood around her, listening to her shout about non-compliant structures and community safety hazards. I watched from my window, coffee in hand, trying to stay calm. I wasn't a troublemaker, but something about her smug tone pushed every button I had. I walked down the path, slow and steady. The crowd turned as I approached. Karen crossed her arms and said, "Look who finally decided to show up." I said, "This is my property, Karen. My cabin. You don't get to hold meetings on it without asking me." She smirked, "You don't own this land outright. The HOA charter clearly allows us to manage shared spaces within the lakeside community. That includes this dock." "Funny," I said, "because the county records list this dock under my deed. Would you like to see the paperwork again?" Some of the crowd murmured. Karen's smile wavered for just a second, but she didn't back down. "We'll see about that," she said, and stormed off with her followers. I thought that would be the end of it, but by evening, I saw flashing lights bouncing off the water. The sheriff's truck pulled up beside my fence. The same deputy from last time got out, looking tired. He said, "She's filed a complaint saying you threatened the HOA board." I blinked. "What?" He nodded, rubbing his forehead. "She claims you told her you deal with her if she didn't leave your dock. Any truth to that?" "None," I said. "I told her I had paperwork, that's all." He sighed. "Look, between you and me, she's making a lot of noise at the county office. I don't know what she's trying to pull, but it's not good. They've started a property review because of her reports. That could freeze any maintenance or upgrades you've got planned." I felt a cold anger settle in my gut. This wasn't about the dock anymore. Karen was trying to bury me in bureaucracy. I said, "So what am I supposed to do, Sheriff? Let her harass me until she gets bored?" He looked uneasy. "Off the record, I'd say document everything. Don't talk to her directly. She's setting a trap, and you might want to look into the HOA's finances. She's got her hands deep in everything around here." That last part stuck with me. After he left, I opened my laptop and started digging. The HOA's website was outdated, barely functional, but buried in a PDF from 2 years back was something odd. An allocation fund for lakeside improvements worth nearly $200,000. No breakdowns, no contractor names, just a vague note, dock reconstruction and aesthetic enhancements. I knew exactly what that meant. Karen had her eyes on my shoreline, and maybe that money was her way of making it happen. The next few days she went quiet, which only made me more suspicious. The neighbors started avoiding eye contact again. One man, Mr. Patterson, finally spoke to me when I was at the post box. He said quietly, "She's planning something big at the next meeting, be ready." I asked what kind of big. He just shook his head and said, she's calling it a safety demolition. Those words hit me like a brick. Demolition, she couldn't mean my cabin, could she? That night I sat on the porch staring at the moonlit lake, thinking about every conversation, every warning. My cabin wasn't just a place. It was my late father's project, his last labor before he passed. He'd built it with his hands, every plank soaked with memories. The thought of Karen tearing it down made my blood boil. So I made a decision. I wasn't waiting anymore. If she wanted to play dirty, I'd dig deep and expose whatever she was hiding. I started making calls to a friend who worked in county records, another who knew a bit about real estate law, and even an old buddy from the local paper. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one, but this time I wasn't just defending my cabin. I was defending my father's legacy. As the clock hit midnight, I sent one last email to the county assessor's office, requesting every document the HOA had filed in the last 3 years. The reply came faster than I expected. The subject line read, "Urgent potential irregularities found." And that's when I knew Karen wasn't just meddling in property disputes. She was stealing from everyone. The next morning, I drove straight to the county office. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like everyone inside knew something you didn't. The clerk who'd emailed me, a young guy named Dan, met me in the hallway looking nervous. He handed me a folder and said quietly, "You didn't get this from me, but you were right. Something off with your HOA." Inside were copies of transfer records, payment approvals, and a spreadsheet that didn't make sense. Tens of thousands of dollars had been moved from the HOA, Community Improvement Fund, into something labeled Private Contractor Reimbursement. No contractor name, no project photos, no invoices, but the bank address, it was linked to a company owned by Karen's cousin. I stared at the pages, feeling my pulse quicken. I said, "So she's laundering HOA funds to herself." Dan nodded, "And if I were you, I'd move fast. The word is she's got a demolition notice ready to file. Once that's in motion, it's almost impossible to stop." The drive back to the lake felt like a countdown. I could see the pieces fitting together. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She was desperate. She needed my cabin gone so she could claim it was part of the redevelopment project and justify those stolen funds. When I pulled up to my cabin, there was a sign planted right at the edge of my dock. It read, "Safety inspection scheduled, structure deemed non-compliant." I ripped it off the post and threw it on the porch. I knew exactly who put it there. That evening, I called a meeting of my own. I printed out the documents and handed copies to every neighbor who'd ever looked uncomfortable when Karen spoke. A few didn't show up, afraid of crossing her, but a dozen did. I laid out the papers on the picnic table and said, "She's been stealing from us. Your HOA fees, your maintenance money, all of it's being funneled through fake companies. She's using this demolition plan as cover." They flipped through the pages, eyes widening. Mr. Patterson shook his head. I knew something wasn't right. She's been pushing for new landscaping, new docks, all while raising our dues. One of the younger neighbors, Jess, said, "So what do we do, call the cops?" I said, "No, not yet. If we go to the police too soon, she'll bury it under paperwork and call it a misunderstanding. We need proof that ties her directly, signatures, transfers, emails, and we need it before she files that demolition." The plan was risky, but it was the only shot. The next morning, I saw Karen outside her house, clipboard in hand, talking to a man in a county vest. She smiled as she pointed across the lake toward my cabin. I could almost hear her voice saying, "eyesore" or "safety hazard." That afternoon, I got an email from Dan again. One line, "She's filing tomorrow." Panic twisted in my chest, but anger steadied me. I spent the night organizing everything, the forged payments, the missing invoices, the contractor records. Then I made a copy of everything and dropped it in a brown envelope at the sheriff's office drop box. I didn't trust anyone else yet. By dawn, I was exhausted, sitting on the porch with black coffee when I heard the crunch of tires. Karen's SUV rolled up, and she stepped out wearing a bright pink blazer and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said. "Thought I'd come by and give you a courtesy notice before we begin the safety inspection." I said, "You mean demolition?" She tilted her head. "Semantics. The HOA voted unanimously. The structure's a liability and the county approved the order." "You really think you can get away with this?" I asked. Her grin widened. "Already have. You'll be seeing a crew here by the end of the week." She turned to leave, but I said, "You might want to cancel that crew." She paused. Why that? I met her eyes. Because the sheriff just got every record you've tried to hide, and this time your cousin's name is all over it. Her smile faltered for the first time since I'd met her. She tried to speak, but no words came out. I continued, you called the cops on me for locking my cabin. Now they're going to call you for stealing from your neighbors. She got back in her SUV and slammed the door, speeding off so fast gravel scattered across the road. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand, but a part of me knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't just back down, they fought dirty to the very end. And as the sun went down behind the lake, I saw the reflection of flashing lights moving toward her house. The sheriff's trucks were already there. I didn't know it yet, but what they found inside her files would turn the whole neighborhood upside down. That evening the lake was unusually quiet. No laughter, no barbecues, no echo of kids skipping stones across the water, just silence. I stood on my porch watching the sheriff's trucks parked in front of Karen's house. Neighbors lingered behind curtains, whispering through cracked blinds. Word traveled fast around here, especially when it was about the Queen of the HOA. After about an hour, the sheriff himself walked out with 2 deputies carrying boxes filled with binders and a computer tower. Karen followed behind, still trying to talk her way out of it, her voice loud enough to carry across the lake. This is a misunderstanding. I have every right to those records. The sheriff didn't even look at her. He said, you'll have your chance to explain, ma'am, for now, step aside. She saw me watching from the dock and her face twisted, not with guilt, with fury. She pointed at me and shouted, you think you've won? You just made the biggest mistake of your life. I didn't answer, I just turned and walked back to my cabin. Later that night, I got a call from Deputy Miller. He said, you might want to come down to the station tomorrow. We'll need a statement about the documents you submitted. Looks like your HOA president's been skimming from community funds for years, and she's not the only one involved. Not the only one, I asked. No, he said quietly. The treasurer and 2 board members signed off on every transfer. They knew. I hung up and stared out the window. The board wasn't just corrupt, it was a network. Karen had built an empire of control through fear and fake friendliness, and I'd just lit the fuse beneath it. By morning, the story had hit the local news. HOA president under investigation for embezzlement flashed across my phone screen. They'd even used a photo of her smiling at the lake's ribbon-cutting ceremony 2 years back. The comments section was on fire, neighbors from other communities sharing their own horror stories about overreaching HOAs. Around noon, a few of my neighbors knocked on my door. Jess, Mr. Patterson, and an older woman named Ruth stood there holding coffee cups and looking relieved. We saw the news, Jess said. It's finally happening. Ruth added, the county's dissolving the HOA board until a new election can be held. They're appointing an interim administrator to handle things. I leaned back in my chair, processing it all. So it's over. Not quite, Mr. Patterson said. Karen posted bail this morning, she's out. That stopped me cold, you're kidding. He shook his head, and she's been saying you set her up, that you forged those records to destroy her reputation. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course she is. That evening I got a knock on the door. When I opened it, Karen was standing there. No clipboard, no smug grin, just a desperate, shaking woman. You ruined me, she said quietly. Do you even understand what you've done? I kept my voice steady. I didn't ruin you, you did that yourself. They'll never believe you're innocent, she hissed. People like me don't lose. I built this neighborhood. I made it worth something. By stealing from it, I asked. She stepped closer, her voice low. You think the county cares about your cabin? They'll condemn it the moment I tell them it's sitting on a flood line. Enjoy your view while you can, because soon there'll be nothing left of it. Before I could answer, she turned and walked away, her heels crunching against the gravel. I watched her disappear into the night, but her words lingered like a storm cloud in my head. I barely slept. The next morning, I found a yellow tag stapled to my fence, notice of potential flood zone review. It was official, stamped by the county office. Karen had made her move. For a moment, I felt the old frustration creeping back in, that helpless feeling of being cornered by paperwork and technicalities. But then I remembered something my father once told me while fixing the dock years ago. If they can't fight your hands, they'll try to fight your ground. So make sure your ground's solid. I pulled out every deed, every permit, every document I'd kept since buying this place. And that's when I saw it, the county's elevation survey, signed by Karen herself back when she was on the planning committee. It clearly marked my cabin as outside the flood line. I almost laughed. She'd hung herself with her own signature. I scanned it, attached it to an email, and sent it directly to the same deputy who'd been handling her case. Subject line, Ray, fraudulent flood claim. That night, thunder rolled in across the lake. Rain started falling, tapping against the roof like a heartbeat. As the lightning flashed, I saw Karen's house across the water, dark, no lights, no movement. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: the storm wasn't just outside. It was coming for Karen, and this time she had nowhere left to hide. The storm lasted all night. Rain poured so hard it blurred the outline of the lake, and the wind slammed against my cabin like it was testing its strength. I didn't sleep a minute. I sat by the window, staring at the distant glow of Karen's house. At some point near dawn, a set of headlights cut through the rain, a county truck. Then another. By sunrise, 2 more sheriff's vehicles rolled in. I didn't need to guess what was happening. Karen's luck had finally run out. By the time the storm broke, the whole neighborhood was outside. Water still dripped from the trees, and the air smelled like wet pine and diesel. The deputies were loading more boxes into their trucks. I saw Karen standing by her front steps, hair plastered to her face, talking to a reporter. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain that she was the victim of a vendetta by a disgruntled property owner. I didn't say anything. I just stood by my fence watching it all. The sheriff spotted me and gave a small nod, the kind that said, "You were right." A few hours later, Deputy Miller came by my cabin with a folder under his arm. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. Inside were copies of the county's findings. Karen had falsified signatures, rerouted HOA funds to personal accounts, and filed fraudulent claims to seize private lots, including mine. There was even a recorded conversation between her and the treasurer, planning to list my cabin as abandoned community property. I closed the folder slowly. "So it's over." "For her, yeah," he said. "She's facing multiple charges: fraud, falsifying public documents, embezzlement. The county's freezing her assets. She won't be running anything anytime soon." For the first time in weeks, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The following week, the HOA was officially dissolved. The county sent a notice saying all property rights reverted to the individual owners until a new community board could be fairly elected. For once, people weren't arguing at the mailbox or whispering at the docks. They were smiling. Neighbors waved again. Kids rode bikes down the road without their parents worrying about HOA fines. Mr. Patterson stopped by with a box of donuts and said, "Never thought I'd see the day." "You did it, son. You actually did it." I laughed. "No, we did it. We finally took our neighborhood back." That night, I walked down to my dock, and sat where my father used to fish. The lake was calm, the moonlight stretching across it like silver glass. The old boards creaked beneath my boots, the same ones Karen had tried to label unsafe. I smiled at the thought. As I sat there, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Jess. She handed me a folded newspaper. On the front page, Karen's mugshot stared back, headline reading, "Former HOA president indicted for fraud and embezzlement." I said, "Never thought I'd see that picture." "She's lucky it ended in court," Jess said quietly. "A lot of folks she hurt were ready to take matters into their own hands." I nodded. "Yeah, but now maybe everyone here can finally breathe." She looked at the cabin, the reflection of its lights dancing on the water. "So what now?" I smiled faintly. "I think I'll finally finish what my dad started. Rebuild the porch, repaint the trim, maybe add a little dockside bench like he always wanted." She grinned. "I guess you've earned some peace." As she left, I sat there a while longer, watching the mist rise off the lake. Somewhere across the water, Karen's house sat dark and empty. Rumor was she'd be selling it off to pay her legal fees. Poetic, really. The woman who tried to destroy my home would lose hers instead. Before heading in, I locked the cabin door, the same lock she once called the cops over. Back then, it was just a small act of defiance. Now it felt like closure. As the night deepened, I realized something simple but true. Sometimes the fight isn't about revenge. It's about holding your ground long enough to remind people that rules without respect mean nothing. And as the wind carried the sound of the lake gently against the shore, I whispered a quiet thanks to my father, to the sheriff, to every neighbor who finally stood up. The storm had passed, the cabin still stood, and so did I. Every HOA has a story. On HOA Headaches, you'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.